Hello, it's 1973 and America's been fighting a losing and bloody battle against the communists in a Southeast Asian country called Vietnam. The communists run the north of Vietnam and are fighting to liberate the southern half of the country, as they see it. The Americans have been trying to stop them. They started sending US troops to Vietnam in 1961, but they've been trying to get them out ever since. Why? Because the war's too costly. It's cost a staggering $146 billion, 50,000 American soldiers' lives, and it's failed to beat the communists. America feels pretty humiliated. Its well-armed troops have been beaten by a poorly equipped guerrilla army of Vietnamese men, women, and children. Not surprisingly, it's the most unpopular war in American history, so it came as a relief that on January the 27th this year, after more than a decade of war, America signed a ceasefire pact with the North Vietnamese communists. At last, the American troops and prisoners of war can finally come home.
Vietnam Peace Pact signed. America's longest war halts.
Sighed the New York Times, whose reporters are as weary of the war as its readers.
Peace with honor reached.
POW freedom in 60 days.
Announced a newspaper called the Atlanta Constitution. It listed the terms of the agreement.
Ceasefire 7 p.m. Saturday. Release of POWs within 60 days. Withdrawal of all U.S. forces. Full accounting of missing in action. Self-determination for South Vietnam.
It's exactly what the American people want, to get their boys out of Vietnam as quickly as possible. Too many have died already. President Nixon's calling it peace with honor. But that's not exactly true. America hasn't won the war. The communists haven't been kicked out of Vietnam. In fact, they're moving into the south. The magazine Newsweek called it
a war without winners.
It's not like the armistice at the end of the Second World War when there were street parties. You see, there's not a lot to celebrate this time around. The American troops were sent to South Vietnam to support a corrupt and unpopular government. Not only have they failed to win the war, but they've killed and tortured the ordinary Vietnamese people they were supposed to defend.
Nation celebrates peace in prayer and muted joy,
said the New York Times solemnly. A few churches rang their bells on the day the ceasefire was signed, but not in celebration. The magazine Newsweek asked,
For whom the bells toll?
For the dead American soldiers, or for the American nation as a whole?
The nation began at last to extricate itself from a quicksandy war that had plagued 4 presidents and driven one from office. That had sundered the country more deeply than any event since the Civil War. That in the end came to be seen by a great majority of Americans as having been a tragic mistake. But its more grievous toll was paid at home, a wound to the spirit so sore that the news of peace stirred only the relief that comes with an end to pain. A war that produced no famous victories, no national heroes, and no stirring patriotic songs. Produced no memorable Armistice Day celebrations either. America was too exhausted by the war and too chary of the peace to celebrate.
These statistics in the New York Times revealed the startling death toll on both sides of the war.
Military casualties: 45,933 Americans killed, 153,300 wounded. 183,528 South Vietnamese killed, 499,026 wounded. 924,048 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed.
That's 20 times more than the Americans. But the American people aren't shocked by the war anymore. Most people are indifferent, said the Atlanta Constitution.
One girl yawned when told the war was over.
No kidding.
She said,
I thought they did that some time ago.
Others have become numbed by the daily barrage of brutal images of war on their televisions and in the newspapers.
I'm glad the war's over. I'm tired of being subjected to all the gory details.
The newspapers have been looking back at those gory details. People used to think war was glamorous and that soldiers were brave heroes. But photographs like these turned the public against the Vietnam War when they were first shown. Many people were so outraged they started a great peace movement. Young people have been protesting the loudest. Students held massive demonstrations against the military draft, which forced men as young as 19 into the army. Some protesters got killed.
At least 2 Americans, one an 82-year-old woman, burned themselves to death to protest the war. And 4 Kent State University students were shot to death by Ohio National Guardsmen during one of the many campus demonstrations against American action in Southeast Asia.
Back in 1968, the anti-war protesters complained that the Vietnam War was a meat grinder, devouring thousands of soldiers, as this cartoon shows. They said the war was morally wrong,
The Viet War stinks.
said the anti-war protesters. And by 1971, even the army generals reluctantly had to admit the protesters were right. The war had gone horribly wrong.
But he had no right to be so right.
During the war, the nation was divided into those for and those against it. Now it's over. Everyone agrees. It was pointless.
Walter Riddick, tax researcher.
It gave us inflation and lack of jobs. It really started a revolution among people here, young against old. The older people were saying, why end the war now? And the younger ones were saying, end it now.
Nell Kirby, restaurant owner.
This war seems worthless, and a crushing amount of time was spent on it. We surely have gone downhill, haven't we?
Nobody's sure how many POWs, or prisoners of war, have survived the terrible treatment in the communist jails, or if the soldiers who went missing in action are still alive. So it's been an anxious time for the families waiting for the troops to return. There are wives who haven't seen their husbands for up to 10 years, and children who've never seen their fathers before. For them, the ceasefire and the return of the troops is something to celebrate.
The prisoners return.
Welcome home, Daddy.
Air Force Major Hayden Lockhart Jr., shot down over the north in 1965, was welcomed home by his wife Jill and a son Jamie, whom he had never met.
The newspapers have been covering every moment of these emotional reunions. It's about the only good thing they've got to say about the war.
Lieutenant Colonel Alan Brunstrom of the Air Force, hugging his wife and their daughter.
Hi, glad to see you. Be happy, you guys.
Their families are happy to have their husbands and fathers home again. The government has rolled out the red carpet and is calling them brave war heroes, but they're not getting a hero's welcome from the rest of the public.
When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah,
Hurrah! Vietnam vets, an unpopular war rubs off.
When the Vietnam veterans have come home, they've found themselves too often treated not as men who had made an extraordinary sacrifice for their country, but as chumps who had been suckered into playing a game the rest of us smart guys had figured out was rigged. They have not been borne home in triumph. Instead, they have been treated too often as unwelcome reminders of an event we would sooner forget.
Many have returned home mentally scarred by the horrific things they've seen and been forced to do. Hasn't anyone got any sympathy for them?
Couldn't find a job. Joined the army. Sent to Nam. 3 tours of duty. Came home, detested. Can't find a job. Amnesty for draft dodgers and deserters? That's cool. But what about amnesty for vets?
America has had its fingers burned by this war, but at least President Nixon has promised that America will never again
Tell the people of other nations how to manage their own affairs.
In other words, there'll be no more Vietnams. It could be a turning point, said the New York Times.
Vietnam spanned the era of American foreign policy after World War II, from the epoch when the prime objective was containment of international communism to the present day when coexistence with communism is seen as possible, necessary, and desirable for mutual benefit and survival.
In other words, instead of fighting the communists, America might learn to live with the Soviet Union and China. Really? Well, we'll have to wait and see. Goodbye.